Deep within the cipher rooms of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, the foundation of a global war strategy rested on a dangerous vulnerability, a single point of intelligence failure. By early 1943, the Imperial Japanese High Command was tethered to the belief that the Third Reich was an invincible industrial juggernaut. This assumption was absolute. Japan was already stretched thin across the Pacific, fighting a sprawling logistical nightmare against the United States. To survive, Tokyo needed Germany to permanently lock Soviet and British forces in a grinding European stalemate, but the intelligence flowing into Tokyo was heavily corrupted at its source. The primary architect of this intelligence was Lieutenant General Hiroshi Oshima, Japan's ambassador to Berlin. Oshima was not merely a diplomat. He was an ideological zealot who enjoyed unprecedented access to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi High Command. He routinely toured front lines, reviewed advanced weapon systems, and dined with senior generals. He transmitted detailed, highly confident reports back to Tokyo, painting a rigid picture of an Axis victory delayed but never denied. Post-war interrogations of Japanese staff officers later confirmed that Oshima's dispatches were treated as infallible gospel by the pro-German factions dominating the army. Unbeknownst to Oshima, his deeply detailed radio transmissions were actively being intercepted and decrypted by Allied codebreakers, inadvertently providing Washington with better intelligence on German intentions than Tokyo was receiving on German realities. Yet, beneath the official summaries presented to Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, fractures were beginning to appear. While Oshima reported exclusively from the curated echo chamber of Berlin, Japanese military attachés stationed in neutral Switzerland and Sweden were gathering a vastly different set of data points. They painstakingly cross-referenced Allied radio broadcasts, monitored European train schedules, and tracked the sheer volume of wounded German soldiers returning from the East. Their suppressed reports painted a grim, statistical reality. The German army was slowly bleeding to death in the snow. For Tojo, this presented a paralyzing contradiction. Could the German war machine actually stall? The answer lay in the rigid, deeply politicized hierarchy of the Japanese military. Tokyo's leadership suffered from profound confirmation bias. Rejecting Oshima's assessments meant admitting that Japan had tied its national survival to a structurally flawed European power, a political impossibility for the original architects of the Tripartite Pact. By filtering out the pessimistic intelligence from neutral attachés, the High Command actively chose diplomatic loyalty over operational reality. They traded objective threat assessment for the comfort of ideological alignment. This comfortable illusion violently collided with reality on the frozen banks of the Volga River. Throughout the winter of 1942, as the Soviet ring closed completely around the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, Oshima forwarded Berlin's strict assurances that a massive relief force would break the encirclement. Tokyo's planning boards obediently adjusted their timelines, expecting a renewed German offensive in the spring. Instead, the operational updates from the Eastern Front grew erratic, then completely silent. The undeniable fracture point arrived on February 2, 1943. The German Sixth Army did not break out, it surrendered. The sheer scale of the geographic collapse bypassed Oshima's optimistic filters. Soviet broadcasts, quickly verified by independent Japanese listening posts, reported the staggering capture of 91,000 German troops, including 24 generals and a newly promoted field marshal. For the first time, the Japanese High Command was forced to process a catastrophic structural defeat of the Wehrmacht. It was no longer a temporary tactical setback. It was the total annihilation of an entire army group. Surviving liaison diaries recorded the deep disbelief radiating through the general staff when the true casualty figures could no longer be suppressed. Within the war ministries of Tokyo, a quiet panic began to set in among the mid-level intelligence officers. The mathematics were irrefutable. Germany was fundamentally vulnerable. More critically, the vast reservoir of Soviet manpower, which Tokyo had assumed was on the verge of exhaustion, was demonstrably expanding. The surrender at Stalingrad triggered the first major crack in Tokyo's strategic foundation. Tojo's cabinet could no longer blindly trust the assessments radiating from Berlin. The absolute illusion of inevitable Axis victory was shattered. forcing a deeply suspicious faction within the Japanese military to realize they needed a new, unfiltered source of truth. The fracture of the Axis alliance began not in Berlin, but in the heavily guarded conference rooms of the Japanese Imperial Navy Ministry. While the Army General Staff remained stubbornly chained to the illusion of a German resurgence, a profound operational paranoia had gripped the naval brass. Their ships were sinking faster than the shipyards at Kure and Yokosuka could replace them. The strategic calculus of the Pacific conflict was disintegrating under relentless American pressure. Fighting a sprawling, resource-starved oceanic campaign, the Navy recognized that their survival depended entirely on the broader global balance of power. They could no longer afford the diplomatic fiction being fed to Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. They needed raw, unvarnished data. To find it, the Navy Ministry quietly authorized a highly classified independent investigation. The assignment fell to Rear Admiral Sokichi Takagi, an analytical and fiercely pragmatic officer devoid of the Army's ideological blindness. Takagi's mandate was unprecedented within the deeply factionalized Japanese military hierarchy. He was explicitly ordered to bypass official diplomatic channels entirely, ignoring the optimistic propaganda radiating from the Tokyo-Berlin axis. Instead, he assembled a clandestine brain trust of economists, civilian industrial experts, and naval intelligence officers. Their sole objective was to accurately calculate the genuine mathematical trajectory of the global war. Takagi's research team operated in strict secrecy, locked away from the peering eyes of the Kempeitai military police. They aggressively discarded Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima's enthusiastic cables. Instead, they scoured intercepted Allied communications, neutral press reports from Lisbon, and maritime shipping registries smuggled out of Switzerland. They painstakingly mapped global industrial capacity, tracking the extraction of raw materials against the staggering tonnage of merchant shipping resting at the bottom of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. They measured steel production, oil refinement, and ball-bearing manufacturing, building a massive statistical ledger of the war's true cost. This deliberate bypass of official intelligence channels exposed a lethal flaw in Tokyo's operating system. By actively walling off its most objective analysts from the Supreme War Council, the High Command had institutionalized a fatal strategic blind spot. They traded accurate, synchronized threat assessment for inter-service political harmony, ensuring the Army and Navy fought virtually separate wars. Takagi's rigorous methodology stripped away the diplomatic theater. The resulting numbers were devastating. His researchers tabulated that the United States was outproducing the Japanese Empire in aircraft and naval vessels by a staggering ratio of nearly 10-1, an industrial disparity that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. But more critically, Takagi turned his analytical lens toward the European theater. Under intense statistical scrutiny, the myth of an unbreakable German fortress evaporated. Surviving post-war interrogation transcripts reveal that Takagi's team accurately concluded German industrial centers in the Ruhr Valley were being systematically dismantled by sustained Allied strategic bombing. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out over its own cities, entirely incapable of replacing veteran fighter pilots at the rate they were being killed. How long could Berlin withstand a multi-front war? The data offered a grim mathematical answer. The Wehrmacht was no longer expanding its borders. It was merely attempting to slow an inevitable geographic compression. This terrifying internal reckoning reached its breaking point in September 1943. Fascist Italy abruptly and unconditionally surrendered to the Allied powers. The sudden, total collapse of Benito Mussolini's regime instantly vindicated Takagi's bleak arithmetic, providing undeniable operational proof that the Axis perimeter was fatally porous. The tripartite pact was functionally dead. Germany was now geographically isolated in Central Europe, structurally incapable of executing another global war-winning offensive, and slowly sliding into a permanent war of attrition it could never survive. Takagi compiled these shattering findings into an unsparing, highly classified final report. The conclusion forced a quiet, paralyzing realization upon the select few naval flag officers permitted to read it. Japan was now effectively fighting the combined, continuously expanding industrial might of the Allied powers entirely alone. To preserve the Japanese home islands against this encroaching armada, the Imperial High Command now had to base its entire defensive strategy on the sobering operational reality that Berlin was merely buying them time. Across the vast, violently contracting expanse of the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese perimeter was buckling under immense operational strain. Following the grueling attritional defeat at Guadalcanal, American amphibious forces were systematically dismantling the outer island chains, bleeding Japanese naval aviation dry and threatening the vital shipping lanes connecting the home islands to the southern resource zones. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's cabinet faced an unsustainable crisis of maritime logistics. To relieve this crushing pressure, Tokyo desperately needed a geopolitical miracle. They required the Third Reich to reclaim the strategic initiative, forcing Washington and London to divert troops, ships, and aircraft away from the Pacific and back to the European theater. The entire Japanese defensive timetable now hinged almost exclusively on the promise of a massive war-winning German summer offensive. Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima eagerly provided the exact validation Tokyo craved. Throughout the spring of 1943, his encrypted cables from Berlin detailed the assembly of a staggering German armored armada gathering near the Soviet salient at Kursk. Oshima relayed Adolf Hitler's personal assurances that the newly deployed Panther and Tiger heavy tanks would cleanly sever the Soviet lines, destroying the Red Army's operational reserves and permanently restoring German supremacy in the East. Japanese planning boards, starved for positive intelligence and desperate for relief, seized upon Operation Citadel. They integrated this promised German resurgence directly into their own grand strategy, confidently projecting that a crippled, destabilized Soviet Union would force the Western Allies to severely delay their Pacific timetables. This desperate reliance on Operation Citadel exposed a fatal analytical flaw within the Japanese High Command. By conflating the sheer concentration of German frontline armor with actual long-term strategic capability, Tojo's cabinet fundamentally misunderstood the changing nature of the global war. They failed to recognize that a single localized offensive, no matter how heavily armed, could not reverse the permanent industrial deficits that Rear Admiral Sokichi Takagi's secret naval committee had already identified. The High Command traded objective threat assessment for the psychological comfort of a promised victory. When the German armor finally rolled forward into deeply fortified, meticulously prepared Soviet defensive belts, the illusion of mechanical superiority met the brutal, grinding reality of industrial attrition. The defining rupture occurred on July 12, 1943, amid the choking dust and burning steel of Prokhorovka. The German armored spearheads did not achieve the promised clean breakthrough. Instead, they collided head-on with a massive Soviet counteroffensive, resulting in the rapid, catastrophic depletion of Germany's irreplaceable panzer reserves. The sheer scale of the mechanized slaughter could no longer be sanitized by Berlin's propaganda ministry or Oshima's enthusiastic filters. Japanese military attachés operating outside of Oshima's direct control soon forwarded devastating operational summaries detailing the carnage. Surviving General Staff records note that by late July, the official liaison briefings in Tokyo were forced to acknowledge the undeniable truth. The German offensive had completely stalled, and the Wehrmacht was actively falling back. The documented loss of thousands of armored vehicles and hundreds of thousands of casualties within a single month shattered any remaining belief in a German resurgence. The failure at Kursk triggered a violent strategic pivot within the Imperial Palace. If Germany could no longer mount an offensive, the Soviet Union remained an unchecked existential threat to the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, and the United States would face absolutely no European distractions to its Pacific island-hopping campaign. The long-held concept of coordinated Axis global operations was instantly abandoned. Forced to accept that their European ally was locked into a permanent, bleeding defensive posture, the High Command frantically redrew the map. Tojo initiated a drastic contraction of Japanese strategic ambitions, officially establishing the absolute national defense sphere. This mandated a deliberate withdrawal from overextended, undefendable Pacific outposts to form an inner perimeter of heavily fortified island bastions. The survival of the empire no longer rested on the hope of a shared Axis victory, but entirely on the grim mathematical calculation of making the approaching American naval armada bleed for every inch of sand. The geographic reality of a two-front European war finally severed the lifeline of Japanese grand strategy. Inside the Supreme War Council, the fragile political survival of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo depended entirely on a geopolitical stalemate in the West. If the Third Reich could bleed the Soviet Union and repel an Allied amphibious assault on the continent, Tokyo still harbored a faint, desperate hope for a negotiated settlement in the Pacific. But the mathematical certainty of Germany's survival was unraveling at an unprecedented speed. The Imperial Japanese Navy was already locked in a death struggle to hold the Marianas, their inner defensive perimeter straining against an overwhelming American fleet. Tojo needed the European fortress to hold. Instead, he watched it violently implode from opposite directions, triggering a crisis that would shatter his government. The first devastating blow arrived on the beaches of northern France. Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima had spent months touring the Atlantic Wall, transmitting highly confident reports back to Tokyo that any Anglo-American landing would be decisively crushed at the water's edge by entrenched German armored divisions. When the massive Allied armada finally breached the Normandy coast, Oshima's assurances disintegrated into frantic, contradictory cables. Surviving foreign ministry records detail the immediate shockwave that hit Tokyo. Not only had the Allies secured a permanent foothold, but the vaunted German counterattack completely failed to materialize. The High Command was forced to process a terrifying geographic reality. Germany was now irrevocably trapped in a true multi-front war of attrition, facing an inexhaustible supply of American manpower and material pouring directly into Western Europe. Before the strategic paralysis of the Normandy invasion could even be fully absorbed, an even greater catastrophe erupted in the east. The Soviet Red Army launched Operation Bagration, a massive mechanized offensive that tore a gaping hole through the center of the German lines in Belarus. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht suffered the total annihilation of Army Group Center, a staggering documented loss of nearly 400,000 men and irreplaceable mechanized reserves. The sheer velocity of the Soviet advance bypassed all diplomatic spin. By failing to recognize the compounding effect of a synchronized multi-theater Allied offensive, the Japanese High Command had critically misjudged the structural endurance of their coalition partner. They had traded the objective reality of industrial warfare for the political comfort of an unbreakable fascist alliance. Now, the undeniable military confirmation of Germany's impending geographic suffocation sat plainly on the planning tables in Tokyo. The simultaneous collapse of the European fronts coincided perfectly with the American breaching of Japan's own absolute national defense sphere. As Allied troops pushed inland from Normandy, United States Marines stormed the beaches of Saipan, effectively bringing the Japanese home islands within range of long-range bombers. The foundational premise of Tojo's entire administration, that Germany would keep the Allies permanently divided, distracted, and unable to concentrate their forces in the Pacific, was completely destroyed. Stripped of this strategic illusion, Tojo's political support within the Supreme War Council instantly evaporated. The Imperial Palace, long quietly dissatisfied with the Prime Minister's management of the war, moved swiftly. Senior statesmen and rival military factions, previously suppressed by Tojo's iron grip, openly rebelled against his leadership. Facing the undeniable collapse of his grand strategy and the imminent threat of American heavy bombers, Tojo had no political capital left to spend. Facing a unified bloc of opposition from both the Navy and senior imperial advisors, Hideki Tojo formally resigned in disgrace. His departure plunged the Japanese High Command into a state of stark defensive fatalism. The men who replaced his cabinet inherited a fractured, starving empire fighting entirely alone against a global industrial superpower. The secret naval intelligence studies previously authorized by Rear Admiral Sokichi Takagi had proven horrifyingly accurate. The tripartite pact had always been a strategic suicide pact. The leadership in Tokyo now understood that the total destruction of the Third Reich was mathematically guaranteed. This forced them to confront the terrifying, unavoidable reality that the full, undivided fury of the Allied war machine would soon be concentrated solely on the skies and shores of the Japanese home islands. The illusion of a shared global victory had been completely replaced by the terrifying mathematics of absolute isolation. Inside the Kasumigaseki diplomatic district, the newly formed Japanese government operated under a crushing, undeniable operational premise. The Third Reich was functionally dead, it simply had not stopped breathing yet. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu inherited a geopolitical nightmare. Every single day, the remnants of the Wehrmacht held out in the burning ruins of Europe was exactly one more day Japan had to prepare its home islands for the inevitable, undivided fury of the entire Allied war machine. Germany was no longer viewed as a coalition partner. It had been reduced to a temporary bleeding shield buying Tokyo a few extra months of preparation. By clinging to the promises of the tripartite pact long past the point of rational military analysis, the High Command had committed a fatal error of strategic pacing. They had traded their own irreplaceable naval and aviation reserves for the psychological comfort of an impending German miracle. Now structurally hollowed out and facing a massive American amphibious armada, Shigemitsu understood that military victory was mathematically impossible. The survival of the Japanese state rested entirely on a desperate, high-stakes diplomatic gamble to keep the Soviet Union from entering the Pacific theater. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine and pushed deep into the German homeland, Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima's once revered dispatches devolved into increasingly irrelevant reports of chaos. Fleeing the relentless aerial bombardment of Berlin, Oshima's final communications offered nothing but the ashes of the fascist alliance. Shigemitsu bypassed him entirely, focusing all remaining diplomatic leverage on Moscow. Surviving foreign ministry cables document Shigemitsu's frantic internal directives, authorizing his envoys to offer vast territorial concessions in Manchuria and the Kuril Islands if Joseph Stalin would simply maintain strict neutrality. It was a strategy born of pure geographic desperation. If the Red Army pivoted east before the Americans could be bled into a negotiated peace, the empire would be crushed in a continental vice. Did Tokyo truly believe Stalin would honor a dying treaty? The blunt answer arrived on April 5, 1945. With Soviet mechanized spearheads preparing to completely encircle Berlin, Moscow formally denounced the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. The diplomatic mask was finally dropped. The timing of the denunciation, perfectly synchronized with the death throes of the Third Reich, confirmed Shigemitsu's darkest fears. The Soviet Union was actively positioning its immense, battle-hardened military apparatus to sweep into Asia the moment Germany capitulated. This catastrophic diplomatic failure severed the final thread of hope within the Supreme War Council. The High Command's realization that Germany was fundamentally lost fundamentally altered their endgame. The strategic objective instantly shifted from any pursuit of conventional victory to a grim, mathematically calculated strategy of pure attrition. If no European ally was coming to distract Washington and no Soviet diplomat was willing to broker a peace, the only currency left to the Japanese Empire was blood. The ultimate consequence of Tokyo's delayed awakening to Germany's collapse was not a swift surrender, but the horrific escalation of defensive fatalism. The High Command systematically transformed the home islands and surrounding approaches into a sprawling, suicidal fortress. They intended to make the approaching American invasion so physically and politically costly that Washington would be forced to abandon the demand for unconditional surrender. The historical ledger of this terrifying realization was written directly into the volcanic ash of the Pacific. When the German High Command finally surrendered in May 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army was already demonstrating the brutal reality of their isolated endgame on Okinawa, where over 100,000 defenders fought to the absolute death in the caves and ridges, knowing with absolute certainty that no reinforcements would ever arrive.